Hi, I'm Kristof from Tomme, and thanks. I'll be talking about developer portals, but not your run-of-the-mill developer portals, because I want to talk about internal developer portals, which is, to some extent, marketing, but it's a little bit contentious. I think often marketing is kind of contentious at API conferences anyway, so I think probably should be fine. But before I do my talks, I always start with a thank you. Because me being here is only possible because a whole lot of people that are making that possible. First of all, I'd like to thank the communities that I'm part of. A lot of the knowledge I'm sharing comes from other communities. So I act as a cross-pollinator, like a bumblebee flying from one community to the next, spreading the word about cool things that other communities are doing. And these are some of them. You'll see things like DITA, which is an XML standard for documentation, Drupal, obviously, because that's a tool we work with, and then a bunch of API conferences, including the one API the Docs that we organize ourselves. I'd like to say thank you to my colleagues because, well, they're not working today, but normally they're working while I'm speaking. And like today is a holiday in Hungary. But without them, it wouldn't be possible to be here, and my family. So, internal developer portals. What is that all about? First of all, why should you care about internal developer portals and internal APIs? You see, my company, Pronovix, we specialize in developer portals. We used to be a Drupal agency doing whatever. And then 3 years ago, we started working exclusively with developer portals. There's some legacy stuff, but most of our new work is all developer portals. And there was something weird we noticed. Because, developer portals, if you go to events like this, you expect, developer portals for marketing purposes, for external-facing initiatives. And to our surprise, we saw that a lot of the really largest projects we're working on, not like, the majority was still external facing, but a lot of the really big ones were actually for internal purposes, for internal developer programs. And that was kind of weird to us because we thought that most people would primarily be interested in the external facing part of it. Because if you go to conferences like this or all of the others there, most of the time people will be talking about external-facing initiatives, about developer marketing. Developer experience is somehow always about how to improve the experience of the people that are going to use your API that might not be at your company and stuff like that. So, and to understand a little bit like why I thought that what we were seeing is that I think that's there's different reasons why businesses make APIs. These are like the run-of-the-mill ones, like to create complementary products for their existing products, maybe to sell APIs as a new kind of product. Mobile IoT is also a big one, and data transactions. But there's also this one, internal agility, and this is huge. If you're doing digital transformation, this is what you're aiming for. And internal agility is about, in a lot of cases, is about APIs inside of your organization and not so much outward facing. And those were the ones that we were seeing that we saw that we're looking for like a different kind of dev portals. So like this is a maturity model from Apigee. Like we partner with Apigee for a lot of their dev portals. And they had this idea of like an internal community and then concentric circles where you can expand the audience. Some organizations will start like focusing on customers first and then move in or move outwards depending on. But internal APIs have like a different place in this set. So where can you learn about internal APIs and internal developer experience? And here comes the problem, because enterprise API owners very often get money to go talk about their programs. Often they can't even get permission because if they would have the money. Because companies don't really like putting out the dirty socks because often it's not that pretty. So, And people like Phil Legater, he's awesome. He's works at Nexmo. He's a developer evangelist. They talk a lot about APIs and API like developer marketing, but it's all about external facing stuff, not so much about internal facing stuff, not about engagement, about developer engagement. So while it might seem that DevRel is like super epic and API marketing and developer experience, like these are very epic things where there's lots of money and you can do amazing things. Often it's a lot more like this, where you have a small group of people that somehow are tasked with trying to make order in a mess and try to standardize people into like there's suddenly a lot of people coming in. so you're, yeah, I hope you still can follow where we are. So the reality of the API programs is often not as glamorous. And what you often see if you have internal developer portals and internal APIs is that there's no budget. You have to get it the first time right because you don't have a second shot. In an external facing DevRel, that's different because your product is your API and you're going to iterate no matter what until it works. And that doesn't work inside of an organization because you just don't get a budget for that. So what are the typical core problems that internal API programs are facing with, and what are kind of solutions for those? I call them the 5 white walkers of motivation death because they kill motivation, they kill engagement. I think in a lot of organizations, these are the reasons why people leave their jobs, because it's just awful doing work that's not really rewarded or where you can't win. So the first one is poor discoverability and redundant work. People hate redundant work. Like if you're doing something and nobody cares and nobody's ever going to use it or reuse it, that doesn't really feel good. And redundant work not only kind of kills motivation, it also creates API friction because you have like, which one should I use? Should I use this one or the other one? And like, which one is still active and that kind of stuff. Second problem is domain language ambiguity. This is maybe a little bit less intuitive, but one of the key things, like all 4 of these are platforms. They're different kind of platforms. Another really good one is containers. The containers for hosting the container software for the container company gets really fun and interesting. If you don't have a clear domain language, then it's very hard to create APIs that everybody will understand. And everybody will create different APIs. And that's going to cause a lot of confusion. So domain language is a big problem. Lack of design standards. If everybody is just doing whatever, and I'm not saying you should go in hard-handed and do some crazy hardcore governance stuff, but still, getting everybody on the same page about API design and getting a design, like a style guide, is a good idea. Just to make sure that people will be able to understand what's going on when they're picking up one API versus a previous API they worked with. Fourth is lack of documentation. Maybe that should have been the first one. I've heard the story about one company where every time they needed to onboard someone into a new API, they would basically set up a workshop because they didn't have documentation, which is kind of weird and very expensive. And I'm not talking about Swagger. Like, I'm not talking about Open API spec. Open API spec is where it starts. You need that for sure. Or one of the other standards, but I'll just say Open API spec because I think that's a winning one at the moment. But you also need tutorials. You need to explain how you get started. And you need a bunch of other documentation for different aspects of the developer journey. If you don't have money to do documentation, there's a couple of patterns that you could look at, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And 5 is fragmented authentication. QRT might be able to help you with that. But there's also other ways, like if you have an API gateway that's sitting in front of your APIs, that can help with a lot of these problems. But what we've seen a lot in companies is that they've got unit 1 that's doing APIs this way, unit 2 is doing it this way, they're doing a third API gateway still, and it's kind of a mess. So like thinking about standardizing and simplifying authentication is probably a good idea. So how can we make all of this better? I think the key is that you need to be hyper efficient. You don't get a second shot. You have to do it right the first time, or as good as you can do it. And I think the key for that is to streamline the API journey. So because I really like this definition of developer experience as the inverse of API friction. Because developer experience is this amorph thing where you don't really know what to do with it. It's like, yeah, we need to improve our developer experience. Oh, great. But where do you start? And API friction is a lot more tangible because you can go look for friction and eliminate it. And I think the best way to look for friction is to look at the developer journey and then to eliminate friction in those aspects of the journey where you're seeing the most problems. Now, this is the downstream developer journey. This is the journey of people that are using your API. This is a really important one. This is the one that marketing is typically about. But there's another one. There's a hidden one, and that's the upstream journey. And if you're doing APIs at scale, you need to think about this one also. Because there's almost nobody talking about this. This is the journey of how you get a large organization to adopt APIs in a large scale. This is about how you're going to go and catalog all the resources that you have and like which ones you should be APifying or however you want to call it. I've seen a lot of these neologisms in companies. And then how you do design in a way that it's going to be standardized and that it's going to be easy to figure out like how it's been done. And then implementation, QA, publish, and feedback and support. So like looking also at the piece that comes before the use of an API and not just the piece that comes afterwards. Because if you do this part right, you're going to get better artifacts, better documentation. It's going to be easier to document. It's going to be easier to use. And it's going to create a better downstream experience to some extent out of the box. It's never completely out of the box, but you're going to get a good head start that way. So a lot of companies I've talked with, they're looking at API repositories for this first part, and then they have the developer portal as a second part. I would argue you probably could merge them. You could create one portal that has both the upstream and the downstream journey, where you have an API lifecycle that different APIs can go through, and then that can evolve and graduate into a public-facing API, where maybe you have more documentation artifacts for public APIs and a few less for internal APIs. But that you can have like this flow through this process. I'll share the slides afterwards. So with API repositories, next I want to talk a little bit about what are, remember the 5 white walkers of motivation death? Like what are the solutions and how can an API repository help address them? So first one is discoverability. You remember the big problem of left hand doesn't know what right hand has been doing, different silos doing different things, nobody even knows what's available. I think discoverability and creating one single repo where all of your APIs are is like a good step for that. Having metadata for different APIs, thinking about the different domains that you're going to have in your APIs, like functional and data domains. Like if you have multiple, for example, if you have a multinational with multiple local chapters with their own data, then those would be like data domains, and then having functional domains that go across those, and trying to standardize a bit how you work with that, so that it becomes easier to aggregate and to reuse. Like we work with one large multinational where they're having problems because they've basically been doing all APIs on their own. So they have a bunch of different APIs with very different experiences, depending if you're in country 1 or country 2. Companies or like customers come to their dev portal or first of all, there's multiple dev portals, and they might start integrating with the wrong API because they thought that this was the API, like, this is the dev portal of this company, so I can use this API, right? But then it turns out that they're in a different business segment, so they needed to use another API, or they're in the wrong country or stuff like that. And then because the API design is not standardized, it's a mess. So like creating one central repository for that is a good place to start. Domain language. Zdenek Nemek, he's also here. He's doing a talk, a keynote talk, I think, tonight. Yeah. He's been doing this thing where he goes into companies and helps them to unify their domain language. Like starting from domain knowledge and unified domain language as a way to inform the API design. Because if this unit thinks a product is this and another unit thinks it's just a little bit different, their APIs are going to be different. And you're going to have serious issues because people will expect certain properties to be there and they won't be there. So like unifying that is a good place to start. Design standards. Arnaud is also one of the speakers here. He's writing a book about good API design. He did this talk in Berlin a little while ago where he talked about API design style guides and how to automatically verify that an API fulfills the style guides requirements. So there's a few tools out there. One from Zalando, Zali, that allows you to do that kind of stuff. But just coming to a style guide and doing governance with a small g, so like, not too oppressive, but still doing some governance, I think is a good idea. Yeah. And then getting onboarding tutorials, make sure you have those. If you don't have people to write them, so first of all, please, if you have the budget, hire a tech writer. They do this much better than anybody else. You can have your product owners do documentation, but probably they have other things to do also. So if you can, hire a tech writer. But if you can't, because you don't have the budget, then you could look at beginner speech patterns. I got a whole talk about documentation patterns. It's too long to go into now. But one of them is like beginner speech, where if you're teaching someone how to use your API, they need to write the docs, and then you put them onto your dev portal. And then permission managements, like to centralize and federate that. Other things to think about is, if you're looking inside, is developer engagement. Gamification, a lot of companies don't like the word, but it's about engagement. There's these 8 dimensions of motivation that you can trigger and that you can work with. Look it up. Yokai Chow, Octalysis framework is a very comprehensive way to get started with this stuff. And then Innersourcing. I'm totally blown away by this community. I didn't get it in the beginning. A couple of years ago, I learned about Innersourcing, and I was like, what's this stuff? But then I attended their one of my first conferences, and I learned about patterns there. And I'm completely blown away. I see patterns everywhere now. Basically, this community works on ways to spread good patterns for spreading cultural change between companies. And they're taking patterns from the open source community and bringing them inside of large companies to get people to collaborate. It's mind-blowing. It's really, really cool. So get involved in this community if you have problems, because tools are great, but they're only the start. If you want to change your culture, you need someone to be working on your culture, and they know how to do that. And I'm going to skip this one because that's how I got interested in patterns. SDKs. I got one more minute. SDKs. How do you do SDKs for all your APIs? Internally, there's no way. Or maybe if you automate it, but even if you automate it, it's probably too expensive for all your internal APIs if you have a couple of different languages. With Innersourcing, you could create an open repository inside your organization where you ask people to create a library, like an SDK implementation for the different languages that they're using. So you want to use this API in Java, you first need to make an SDK in Java and contribute that back to the project. And we're going to maintain it together as an organization. So next time somebody needs that API, they're reusing that library. So that's like one tip that you could take from the Innersourcing community. Patterns, I shortly explained it. I can't go into detail here. I'll be publishing more about this stuff. If you want more about documentation, developer portals, and patterns for documentation, we got a newsletter where we publish a lot of that stuff. There's basically it's like standard things or patterns that have shown to work in one company that you can implement in your company. Like docs as code is a really big one, where you manage documentation as you would manage code in a code repository with pull requests and stuff like that. Summary. We need more talks about internal APIs because it's a whole big field and it's a huge problem. There's different problems, and there are serious issues for motivation, which is a serious HR problem. So you probably should be concerned about this and should be thinking about this. You need to think about both journeys, not just the downstream journey, but also the upstream journey if you're doing APIs at scale. And the upstream journey is different, and you should have documentation specifically for that. And yeah, processes and tooling and a lot of cultural change can make things better from the get-go so that you get a better result out of the box. And these are two communities that you could start looking for ways to do that cultural change. And that's it. Hopefully we'll get more meaning and less hodor in our communities. Thank you.
All right, let's go.